Michael Myers, Ghostface, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees. These names alone conjure up images of fear, laughter, and at times, extreme disappointment. Ever since the slasher was born in the 1960s, and the slasher craze exploded in the 70s, these iconic characters have been gracing the silver screen with remakes, endless sequels, and various timelines alike. Over the course of the last 50 years, we've had these same masked villains stalk and kill with no signs of slowing down. But this brings up a question. Will the time come for them to put their weapons down and step aside for a new pantheon of terror? Does the world want, or even need, new iconic slasher villains anymore? Well, let's take a stab at it. So what even makes an iconic horror villain? To answer this, first we have to look back at the landscape of the world from which these iconic horror villains were born. And then, we can see what it was about these stories that scared and inspired people so much. And where better to start than the local news?
On the second floor of this building, Ted Bundy is under constant guard.
Police won't confirm a newspaper report that Dahmer has confessed to murder and cannibalism.
During band of members of a so-called religious cult with a leader they call Jesus has had 3 of its followers arrested in the investigation of the murder of Sharon Tate and 6 others.
Serial killers. The 70s and the 80s in particular were thought of as some of the deadliest decades in recorded history when it came to killers, and that morbid, macabre interest captivated a generation. Part 1. The relationship. The most successful icons rely on an intimate and credible relationship with a rebel world. In the 1970s alone, people were turning on their TVs and hearing about the Manson family, the Zodiac Killer, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and many more. Some were horrified and outraged at the violence of their modern world, but for others, serial killers made for some of the most engaging and terrifying live TV a person could watch. And writers and filmmakers capitalized on that from the very beginning. They looked to what scared them, and they looked to what this audience, with a guilty pleasure for murder, wanted to see, and they built a relationship with this world. Icons are encapsulated myths. They are powerful because they deliver myths to us in a tangible form, thereby making them more accessible. The most iconic villains of horror grew out of these scary and very real killers that then warped them into myths for the big screen. For proof, we need look no further than Ed Gein. For the unaware, Ed Gein was an American serial killer whose gruesome crimes gained worldwide notoriety in the late 1950s. He was known for murdering women who had a resemblance to his own mother, digging up and mutilating corpses, and much, much more. In the years since his arrest, countless books and movies have been inspired by his actions. Psycho, Buffalo Bill, The Devil's Rejects, all drew some sort of inspiration from him. The most notable being the now iconic villain of Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who's been cutting people to ribbons since 1974 and has shown no signs of stopping. Slashers pulled from the real-life horrors of the world and mythicized them into these boogeymen who lurked in every dark corner, just waiting to strike. In doing so, filmmakers were able to not only reach the audience which actively watched real killers on TV, but also they made it more accessible for those who had no interest in real murder by providing them with fabricated killers in a fictional world. Part 2. Impact. The biggest factor that decides the difference between talent and icon is impact. Will your legacy live on, and how will people remember you? With the landscape of serial killers and movies bringing murderers into mythical status, the other huge factor in making a horror icon is impact. What image will stay with the audience? Who are they going to see in their nightmares when they close their eyes? Where story and connection to the audience's fear is what attracts the viewers, image and staying power are where an iconic horror villain is truly born. John Carpenter's Halloween stands the test of time as the perfect example. Before the name Michael Myers was on everybody's lips, people shook in horror at the image of The Shape. This tall, looming figure with no definable features and this blank, paper-white face with hollow, dark eyes. It burned itself into people's imaginations from the moment it was released. People have marked that seeing The Shape for the first time filled them with this deep and lasting fear that they simply couldn't get enough of. Moviegoers simply had to see more. People had to know more about Michael Myers, and every time he appeared on screen, his fame only grew. More than that of any other slasher villain, The Shape has stood the test of time, even to this year, with Halloween Ends set to release soon. An iconic character is essentially someone whose presence is so desirable that it independently elevates their story. After Halloween, horror movies followed suit in creating dark characters, with hidden or hideous faces, complete with their own weapons, geared towards creative kills and increasingly insane sequels. Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, even Hellraiser, all building their own uniquely fun killers with long-spanning franchises and lore. And for decades since their creation, hearing about or seeing them has instantly drawn in a crowd of eager horror fans. Thanks to time and the love and dedication of the horror community, these characters have grown into the modern iconic villains they are today. So, when did this all stop? Part 3. Experimentation. With most icons, a lot of this boils down to the originator factor. They set the precedent as the first of their kind, with virtually every character since having to measure up to them. After the slasher boom, the draw and staying power of new slasher icons began to dwindle. At the start of the 90s, people began to grow tired of seeing the same thing time and time again. The old reliable slasher formula began to become cheesy and predictable. People were no longer scared of these films because they could see everything coming before it happened. Nothing could live up to those original films, and any comparison with the classics were met with more disdain than praise. With this, the slasher brand got knocked down to cult status with niche audiences rather than drawing in huge crowds. New types of horror filled the scene of the 90s, giving alternative frights in movies like The Haunting or Jacob's Ladder. Vampire movies also picked up more popularity in films like Dracula or Interview with the Vampire, and the slasher almost looked like it was on its way out. And then, Scream was released. An icon is someone who uses their talent to introduce a new concept into their field, all while knowing how to display their image to the public. In 1996, Scream completely changed the game of the slasher. It virtually created meta-horror, playing to the audience's knowledge of the horror movie formula, while also taking big strides in changing the game of what a slasher could really be. Almost immediately, Scream clones began releasing every year following it. I Know What You Did Last Summer, or Urban Legends are great examples of this. With new concepts and a strong public image, Ghostface attained icon status almost immediately, a feat that no horror villain of this era would ever achieve. It would also prove to be the birth of the last great icon. Now, this is not to say that there haven't been strong and memorable villains since. Jigsaw and Annabelle are both great characters in their own right, but neither of them really come from slashers. They are closer to what would be considered honorable mentions than top-notch. In the 2000s, we began to see a shift in storytelling. Some, if not all of the camp of the 90s horror was replaced by darker, grittier movies. Gore and disturbing imagery seemed to dominate what audiences were looking for during this period of time. And with this new, grittier tone, remake after remake started to flood the theaters, trying to do all of the same things, but with more disturbing results. With the remakes, people seemed to try less to fabricate new iconic villains, and more wanted to bring them back with a vengeance, to varying levels of success. This decade of experimentation fell short in many ways, leading to even bigger leaps in the 2010s. At this point, culture began to take a big shift as well. Where the 1970s through the 90s shined a light on killers and the stories of these real-life boogeymen, and the 2000s tried to recapture a dying formula, the 2010s started to focus more on people. As a society, we want to tell the story of victims and the survivors of tragedy more than we want to hear about who this killer was. Whether it's innocent people being killed by an unjust legal system or murdered in cold blood, we want to know about these individuals and what they've overcome, or the message that their loss holds to those still alive, and horror movies have followed suit. Part 4. A New Normal. As an ideology loses its relevance, people lose faith in its tenets. Experimentation ensues, historical ingredients are reworked, and society finally arrives at a new consensus. Modern horror, especially slashers, are focused on smaller, intimate stories these days with smarter killers and smarter victims. Where the final girl of the past was by and large a virginal survivor barely making it out by the skin of her teeth, the final girl now often becomes an action hero by the end. They take after the Ripleys and the Sarah Connors of the past, hardening from their experience or learning to fight back as a result. This shift was happening as early as 2013 with the release of You're Next, and has only grown today with things like Ready or Not. In fact, when it comes to slasher villains now, iconic or not, the real meat of their story is generally tied to the final survivor. Halloween Ends, Scream 5, X, The Black Phone. All of these are more than just mysterious killer with a soon-to-be-discovered link to the victim starts picking off people one by one. Now they're all unique. The story of a decades-long conflict and trauma. The toxicity of fans and generational tension. The envy and loss of youth and beauty. Or a coming-of-age tale where growth comes at the cost of extreme hardship. In this modern horror climate, we love seeing the icons of the past. You've got to cash in on that nostalgia, right? But filmmakers don't seem to be going out of their way to create franchise villains anymore. Especially not when they can take an old icon and breathe new life into them by using the modern formula. The way it's looking, the horror films of today have outgrown the need for new icons. The way things operate now, we've been given a beautiful variety of films, all with unique and creative takes on the villains and their survivors. There will always be a place for the killers we love, but there is less need to rely on the draw of one character again and again and again to make a horror movie worth seeing. In a lot of ways, society these days has outgrown the need for an icon. So, back to the big question from the beginning. Do we need new slasher icons? I would say no. But who knows? Perhaps the next generation of horror icons is already among us, and we just don't know it yet. I suppose only time will tell.